The laughter at the dinner table sounded warm, but to them, it felt hollow. The elderly couple sat quietly at the far end, smiling, nodding, pretending not to notice the whispers, until the daughter-in-law leaned close to someone and said words that froze them mid-breath. She thought they were too old to hear, too tired to understand, but every syllable cut deep. Her voice was cold, deliberate, a plan to take everything they had built, every memory, every piece of the home they'd worked their lives for. The husband's hand trembled beneath the table. The wife's eyes filled, not with anger, but with heartbreak. That night, before dessert was served, they stood up quietly and left. No one noticed right away. But what happened after they walked out of that house would change the entire family forever. Stay with me until the end, because this story will break your heart and then heal it in a way you'll never forget. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's begin. Thomas and Margaret Hayes had been married for 52 years. 52 years of shared mornings, folded laundry, arguments over the thermostat, and quiet moments watching the sun dip below the horizon from their back porch. They weren't wealthy people, never had been. Thomas worked at the steel mill for 38 years before his back gave out. Margaret taught piano lessons from their living room until arthritis claimed her fingers. Together, they raised 2 sons in a 3-bedroom house on Cedar Lane, the same house they'd saved every penny to buy back in 1971. That house held everything. The pencil marks on the kitchen door frame that tracked the boys' growth. The chipped tile in the hallway where their youngest, Daniel, had dropped his first bicycle. The garden Margaret tended every spring with roses she'd planted the year they moved in. Every corner whispered a memory. Every creak in the floorboards told a story. Their oldest son, Richard, had moved 3 hours away after college. He called twice a month, visited on holidays, always promised to come more often, but never quite managed it. Daniel, their youngest, had stayed closer. He married a woman named Vanessa, sharp-eyed and quick-tongued, and they lived just 20 minutes down the road. Daniel visited regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes with Vanessa, and lately, their teenage daughter Emma tagged along less and less. It was Daniel who suggested the family dinner. Margaret had been thrilled. She spent 2 days preparing, roasting a chicken the way Thomas liked, baking her famous apple pie, setting the table with the good dishes they only used for special occasions. Thomas vacuumed the living room, dusted the mantel, even put on his dress shirt, the one with the buttons that didn't quite line up anymore but still looked presentable enough. When everyone arrived, the house filled with noise. Richard showed up with his wife, Claire, and their 2 young boys, who immediately ran circles around the furniture. Daniel walked in with Vanessa and Emma, who spent the first 10 minutes scrolling through her phone without looking up. Vanessa wore a tight smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes, and she kissed Margaret on the cheek with all the warmth of someone greeting a stranger. Dinner began well enough. The conversation flowed around stories of the grandchildren, updates on Richard's job, polite questions about Margaret's health. Thomas sat at the head of the table, carving the chicken with steady hands, while Margaret poured lemonade and urged everyone to eat more. The laughter came in bursts, mostly from the children, and for a while, it felt like the family gatherings Margaret remembered from years past. But something was off. Thomas noticed it first. The way Vanessa kept glancing at Daniel, her eyes sharp, her mouth pressed into a thin line whenever Margaret spoke. The way Daniel avoided looking directly at his parents, focusing instead on his plate, pushing food around with his fork. Richard seemed oblivious, talking loudly about his promotion at work, but Claire kept shooting worried looks across the table. Margaret felt it too, though she couldn't name it, a tension that hung in the air like smoke, invisible but suffocating. After the main course, while Margaret cleared plates and brought out dessert, Vanessa leaned toward Daniel's ear. She thought she was being discreet. She thought the clatter of dishes and the chatter of children would drown her out. But Margaret's hearing, though weaker than it once was, still caught fragments. Thomas, sitting just a few feet away, heard every word. The house is worth at least $400,000 now. Maybe more with the right appraisal. We could flip it or rent it out. Either way, it's wasted on them. They can't even maintain it properly anymore. Look at the gutters. Look at the paint. They're too old to keep up with it. And honestly, it's irresponsible to let a property like this sit here when we could be using the equity. Daniel murmured something inaudible, his head down. Vanessa continued, her voice dropping to a hiss but still clear enough. Your mother's health isn't getting better. Your father can barely climb stairs. They need to be in a facility anyway, somewhere with nurses, with people who can actually take care of them. We're not being cruel, we're being practical. Once they're settled somewhere safe, we handle the estate and everyone benefits. Richard gets his share, we get ours. And your parents get the care they actually need instead of pretending they can still manage on their own. Thomas's fork slipped from his hand and clattered against his plate. No one seemed to notice except Margaret, who turned from the counter and met his eyes. In that single glance, she knew. She saw the color drain from his face, saw the way his jaw tightened, saw the flicker of something she hadn't seen in decades. Betrayal. Margaret set the pie down on the counter, her hands shaking. She walked slowly back to the table, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what she'd just heard. The room continued its noise around her. Richard's boys were arguing over a toy. Claire was asking Emma about school. Richard was laughing at something Daniel said. But to Margaret, it all sounded distant, muffled, like she was underwater. She looked at her son, Daniel, the boy who used to crawl into her lap during thunderstorms. Daniel, who cried when his goldfish died and made her promise they'd have a funeral in the backyard. Daniel, who once told her she was the best mom in the whole world. That Daniel sat across from her now, silent, complicit, unwilling to even meet her gaze. Thomas pushed his chair back slowly. The scrape of wood against the floor finally drew attention. Richard stopped mid-sentence. Claire looked up. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. Margaret stood as well, her movements careful, deliberate. She placed her napkin on the table, smoothed down the front of her dress, and took a breath. We're going to step outside for a moment. Her voice was calm, too calm. Thomas moved toward the door without a word, and Margaret followed. Behind them, the table fell silent. Richard called after them, asking if everything was all right. Daniel finally looked up, confusion crossing his face. Vanessa's expression remained unreadable. The screen door closed softly behind them. Outside, the evening air was cool. The sun had set an hour ago, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the driveway. Thomas stood on the porch, his hands gripping the railing, his shoulders rising and falling with each breath. Margaret stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thomas turned to her, and his voice came out rough, broken. Did you hear what she said? Margaret nodded, unable to trust her own voice. She wants to take the house. She wants to put us somewhere, like we're a problem to solve. Margaret's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back. She wouldn't cry. Not yet. Daniel didn't stop her. That was the part that hurt most. Not Vanessa's scheming, not the cold calculation in her words, but the silence of their son. The boy they'd raised, the man they'd sacrificed for, had sat there and said nothing. Thomas straightened, his jaw set. We're not going back in there. Margaret looked at him, startled. What do you mean? I mean, we're leaving. Right now. Tonight. We're not sitting through dessert while they smile at us and plan how to carve up our lives. I won't do it. I won't sit there and pretend I didn't hear what I heard. Margaret's heart pounded. Leaving felt reckless, impulsive, but staying felt impossible. She thought of the pie cooling on the counter, the grandchildren who hadn't finished eating, the family gathered around the table. But then she thought of Vanessa's words, of Daniel's silence, and suddenly none of it mattered. Where will we go? I don't know. Anywhere but here. Thomas walked to the car, his steps heavy but determined. Margaret followed, her mind spinning. She didn't grab her purse, didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a note. She simply got into the passenger seat, and Thomas started the engine. The car pulled out of the driveway slowly, headlights cutting through the darkness. Inside the house, the family continued talking, unaware that the two people who had built that home, who had filled it with love and sacrifice and decades of memories, were driving away into the night, and they weren't coming back. The car rolled down Cedar Lane in silence. No radio, no conversation, just the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the suspension as Thomas navigated the familiar streets of their neighborhood. Margaret stared out the window, watching houses blur past, each one holding families inside who probably had no idea how fragile everything really was. Thomas gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. His knuckles whitened. His breathing came shallow and quick. Margaret reached over and placed her hand on his knee, a gesture they'd shared countless times over 5 decades. He glanced at her briefly, and in that moment, she saw everything: the anger, the hurt, the bewilderment of a man who'd spent his entire life providing for his family, only to discover he'd become a burden in their eyes. "Where are we actually going?" Margaret's question hung in the air. Thomas didn't answer right away. He turned left at the intersection, away from the direction of their usual haunts, away from the grocery store where they shopped every Thursday, away from the church where they'd attended services for 30 years, away from everything familiar. "I don't know yet, but we're not staying where we're not wanted." His voice cracked on the last word. Margaret felt her chest tighten. She wanted to argue, to say they were overreacting, to suggest they go back and confront Daniel and Vanessa directly, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down, she knew Thomas was right. Something had broken tonight that couldn't be fixed with a simple conversation. They drove for 20 minutes before Thomas finally pulled into the parking lot of a small diner on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered weakly, advertising 24-hour breakfast and the best coffee in the county. Neither of them was hungry. Neither of them wanted coffee, but they needed somewhere to sit, somewhere to think, somewhere that wasn't their house or their son's dining room. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. A tired waitress with graying hair and kind eyes greeted them with a practiced smile and gestured toward a booth by the window. They slid in across from each other. The vinyl seats cracked and patched with duct tape. The smell of bacon grease and burnt toast filled the air. "Coffee?" The waitress appeared with a pot before they could answer. Margaret nodded. Thomas did too. She poured 2 cups, left a couple of menus on the table, and retreated without pressing them to order. Something about their faces must have told her they needed space. Margaret wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. She stared into the dark liquid, as if it might hold answers. Thomas spoke first. "I built that house with my own hands. Not literally, but you know what I mean. Every mortgage payment, every repair. Every time something broke, I fixed it. I painted those walls. I replaced that roof twice. I put in the new furnace when the old one died in the middle of winter. That house is ours. We earned it. We paid for it. And now she wants to take it, like we're just sitting on some asset she's entitled to." Margaret looked up at him. "She thinks we can't take care of ourselves anymore. Can we?" The question startled her. Thomas met her eyes, and she saw something she hadn't seen before: doubt. "I'm 74 years old, Margaret. My back hurts every morning. I can't lift things like I used to. I forget where I put my keys half the time. Maybe she's right. Maybe we are too old." Margaret felt a flash of anger, sharp and sudden. Don't you dare let her make you believe that. Yes, we're older. Yes, things are harder than they used to be. But we're not helpless. We're not incompetent. And we're certainly not ready to be shipped off to some facility so they can sell our home out from under us. Thomas looked down at his coffee. Daniel didn't say a word. "That's what gets me. She said all of that. And he just sat there. Our son, the boy we raised. He didn't defend us. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't even look uncomfortable. It was like he agreed with every word." Margaret's anger softened into something heavier. Sadness, maybe he did. The thought was unbearable, but it had to be spoken. Maybe Daniel had been thinking the same things Vanessa said. Maybe he'd been too afraid to voice them himself, and she'd simply said what he'd been feeling all along. Maybe their son, the one who used to beg for bedtime stories and hold Margaret's hand crossing the street, had stopped seeing them as his parents and started seeing them as a responsibility he no longer wanted to carry. Margaret took a sip of coffee. It was bitter and too hot, but she drank it anyway. What do we do now? Thomas leaned back in the booth, his shoulders sagging. I don't know. I really don't know. For the first time in their marriage, Margaret saw her husband completely lost. Thomas had always been the steady one, the problem solver, the man who could fix anything, whether it was a leaky faucet or a scraped knee. But this was beyond repair. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the occasional car pass by outside, headlights sweeping across the diner windows. The waitress refilled their coffee without asking. A man in a trucker's cap sat at the counter, hunched over a plate of eggs. The Zekati cook clanged pots in the back. Life went on around them, indifferent to their pain. Finally, Margaret spoke. We could call Richard. Thomas looked at her skeptically. Richard lives 3 hours away. He's got his own family, his own life. He doesn't need us dumping this on him. He's still our son. He deserves to know what's happening. Thomas considered this. Richard had always been different from Daniel. More independent, more distant, but also more honest. He didn't sugarcoat things. He didn't pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. Maybe Richard would understand. Maybe he'd even care. Margaret pulled her phone from her pocket. Her hands shook slightly as she scrolled through her contacts. She found Richard's number and stared at it for a long moment before pressing call. The phone rang 4 times before he picked up. Mom? Is everything okay? His voice was alert, concerned. It was late, nearly 10 o'clock, and Margaret never called this late unless something was wrong. Richard, we need to talk. She told him everything. About the dinner, about Vanessa's words, about Daniel's silence, about driving away and ending up at a diner with no idea what to do next. She spoke quickly, afraid that if she slowed down, she'd start crying and wouldn't be able to stop. Richard listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a long pause. Where are you right now? Margaret looked out the window at the flickering neon sign. A diner called Rosie's, on Route 9. Another pause. Stay there. I'm coming. Richard, you don't have to drive all the way out here tonight. We just needed to talk to someone. Mom, I'm coming. Don't move. Don't go back to the house. Don't call Daniel. Just stay there, and I'll be there in 3 hours. The firmness in his voice left no room for argument. Margaret felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly knocked the breath out of her. Okay, we'll wait. Richard hung up. Margaret set the phone down on the table and looked at Thomas. He's coming. Thomas nodded slowly. For the first time since they'd left the house, something resembling hope flickered in his eyes. They ordered food they didn't want, picked at fries and sandwiches that tasted like cardboard. The waitress checked on them twice, each time with that same knowing look that said she'd seen people in crisis before and knew better than to pry. Time moved slowly. The clock on the wall ticked forward in agonizing increments. Margaret's mind wouldn't stop replaying the evening. She kept hearing Vanessa's voice, cold and calculating, reducing their entire lives to a real estate transaction. She kept seeing Daniel's face, blank and unreadable, offering no resistance, no defense. She kept wondering how they'd missed the signs. Had Vanessa always felt this way? Had Daniel? Thomas stared out the window, his jaw clenched, his fingers drumming against the table. He looked older tonight than he had this morning. The weight of betrayal had aged him in hours. When the door finally opened and Richard walked in, both of them looked up with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Richard was still in his work clothes, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled. He must have left the moment he hung up the phone. He crossed the diner quickly and slid into the booth next to Margaret, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. I'm so sorry. Margaret leaned into him, and the tears she'd been holding back finally came. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet streams running down her cheeks as Richard held her. Thomas looked away, blinking hard, refusing to let himself break. Richard looked at his father. "Tell me everything again. I want to hear it from you too." Thomas recounted the evening, his voice steadier now, but still edged with bitterness. Richard listened, his expression darkening with every detail. When Thomas finished, Richard sat back and exhaled slowly. "This is insane. Vanessa has always been a piece of work, but this?" And Daniel just sat there? He didn't say a word. Richard shook his head. "I'm calling him." Margaret grabbed his arm. "Richard, wait. Maybe we should think this through first." "There's nothing to think through, Mom. They can't do this. They can't just decide your lives are inconvenient and start planning to take everything you've worked for. That's not how this works." He pulled out his phone and dialed Daniel's number. It rang twice before Daniel picked up. "Richard? What's going on?" "Mom and Dad just left without saying anything, and Vanessa's freaking out because she thinks she said something wrong and—" Richard cut him off. "She did say something wrong, and you did something worse. You sat there and let her." Daniel's voice shifted, defensive. "What are you talking about? Don't play dumb. Mom and Dad heard everything. About selling the house, about putting them in a facility, about treating them like they're some kind of problem you need to solve." Silence on the other end. Richard's voice grew sharper. "You really thought that was okay? You really thought you could sit there at their table, eat their food, and plan how to carve up their lives without them noticing? It's not like that. Then what is it like, Daniel? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds exactly like that. Vanessa was just talking. She didn't mean, she meant every word, and you didn't stop her." Another long silence. Then Daniel's voice came back, quieter. "Where are they? Somewhere safe. Somewhere they don't have to worry about their own son plotting against them." "Richard, come on. You're being dramatic." "Am I? Because I think dramatic would be driving 3 hours in the middle of the night to make sure my parents are okay after finding out their youngest son wants to steal their house." Daniel's voice hardened. "Nobody's stealing anything. We were talking about options, about what's best for them. What's best for them? Or what's best for you and Vanessa?" No answer. Richard exhaled. "You need to figure out what kind of man you want to be, Daniel. Because right now, you're not someone I recognize." He hung up. The diner fell silent again. Margaret wiped her eyes. Thomas stared at the table. Richard leaned back in the booth, his anger simmering just below the surface. "You're both staying with me. Tonight. Tomorrow. However long you need." Margaret shook her head. "Richard, we can't impose like that. You have Claire and the boys. You're not imposing. You're family. And family doesn't get thrown away because it's inconvenient." Thomas finally spoke. "We don't want to be a burden." Richard looked at his father, and his voice softened. "You're not a burden. You never have been. And anyone who thinks you are doesn't deserve to be part of this family." Margaret reached across the table and took Thomas's hand. He squeezed back, his grip firm despite the tremor in his fingers. They left the diner together, the three of them walking out into the cool night air. Richard's car was parked next to theirs. He suggested they follow him back to his place, and they agreed. As Thomas started the engine, Margaret looked back at the diner one last time, at the flickering neon sign and the worn booths visible through the window. Something had ended tonight, but maybe, just maybe, something else was beginning. The drive to Richard's house stretched longer than 3 hours. Exhaustion pressed down on all of them, but sleep felt impossible. Margaret watched the highway lights blur past, each one a small beacon in the darkness, while Thomas kept both hands on the wheel, following Richard's taillights ahead of them. Every mile took them further from the life they'd known, from the house they'd built, from the son who'd let them down. Richard lived in a suburb on the other side of the state, in a neighborhood of neat lawns and 2-story homes with attached garages. The kind of place where people waved to their neighbors and kids rode bikes in cul-de-sacs until the streetlights came on. When they finally pulled into his driveway, it was past 1 in the morning. The porch light was on, and Claire stood in the doorway, her face etched with concern. She rushed out before they'd even turned off the engine, pulling Margaret into a hug the moment she stepped out of the car. "I'm so glad you're here. Richard told me everything." Claire was a gentle woman, soft-spoken and thoughtful, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and sent handwritten thank you notes. She'd always made Margaret feel welcome, never once treating her like an obligation. Now, standing in the driveway in her pajamas with her arms wrapped around Margaret, she felt like a lifeline. "Come inside. I've got the guest room ready." Thomas moved slowly, his body stiff from hours of sitting. Richard took his arm without asking, steadying him as they walked up the front steps. Inside, the house smelled like lavender and clean laundry. Toys were scattered across the living room floor, evidence of the boys who'd been put to bed hours ago. Family photos lined the walls, frozen moments of happiness that felt impossibly distant now. Claire led them down the hallway to a room at the back of the house. The bed was already made with fresh sheets, 2 towels folded neatly on the dresser. A lamp cast warm light across the walls. The bathroom's right across the hall. "If you need anything at all, just knock on our door. We're right next to you." Margaret nodded, too tired to speak. Claire squeezed her hand and left, closing the door softly behind her. Thomas sat down on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped forward. Margaret sat beside him, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Finally, Thomas spoke. "I don't know how we got here." Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder. "Neither do I." They stayed like that for a while. 2 people who'd weathered 52 years together now facing a storm they'd never anticipated. Eventually, they changed into the spare clothes they kept in their car for emergencies, a habit from years of road trips and unexpected overnight stays. They climbed into bed, the unfamiliar mattress too soft, the pillows too firm, everything just slightly wrong. But they were together, and for tonight, that had to be enough. Morning came too quickly. Margaret woke to the sound of children's voices drifting through the walls, high-pitched and full of energy. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then memory crashed back, heavy and suffocating. She turned to find Thomas already awake, staring at the ceiling. "Did you sleep? A little? You? Not much." They dressed slowly, both of them moving like people recovering from an injury. When they emerged from the bedroom, they found Richard in the kitchen making coffee while Claire prepared breakfast. The boys, 6-year-old Nathan and 8-year-old Lucas, sat at the table with bowls of cereal, their eyes wide with curiosity. "Grandma, Grandpa, are you staying with us now?" Nathan's question hung in the air. Claire shot him a warning look, but Margaret managed a small smile. "Just for a visit, sweetheart." Lucas, the older and more perceptive of the two, studied them carefully. "Did something bad happen?" Richard intervened before they had to answer. "Grandma and Grandpa are going through some grown-up stuff right now, but they're safe here, and that's what matters." The boys seemed satisfied with this non-answer and returned to their cereal. Richard poured coffee for his parents and guided them to the table. Claire set down plates of eggs and toast, food neither of them wanted but knew they should eat. They picked at their breakfast while Richard outlined what he'd been thinking about all night. "First thing we need to do is make sure the house is secure. Do Daniel or Vanessa have keys?" Thomas nodded. "Daniel has a spare. Always has in case of emergencies." Richard frowned. "We should change the locks. Today, if possible. I don't trust them not to go in there while you're gone." Margaret felt a chill run through her. "You really think they would? After last night? I don't know what they're capable of." Claire spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "We also need to think about legal protection. If Vanessa's serious about this, she might try to pursue guardianship or power of attorney. We need to make sure you're both protected." Margaret's hands trembled around her coffee mug. How did it come to this? How did we go from a family dinner to talking about legal protection from our own son? Nobody answered, because there was no good answer. They finished breakfast in heavy silence, and afterward, Richard made phone calls. First to a locksmith who agreed to meet them at the house that afternoon. Then to a lawyer friend who specialized in elder law. Then, after a long hesitation, to Daniel. Margaret and Thomas sat in the living room, watching through the window as Richard paced the backyard with his phone pressed to his ear. They couldn't hear the conversation, but they could see the tension in his posture, the sharp gestures of his free hand. When he came back inside, his face was grim. Daniel wants to talk. He says Vanessa didn't mean it the way it sounded, that they were just discussing hypotheticals, that you misunderstood. Thomas's jaw tightened. We didn't misunderstand anything. I know. I told him that. He's upset that you left without saying anything. He thinks you're overreacting. Margaret felt anger spark in her chest. Hot and unfamiliar. Overreacting? We heard our daughter-in-law planning to sell our house and put us in a home like we're furniture she's tired of. How exactly are we supposed to react? Richard held up his hands. I'm on your side. I'm just telling you what he said. He wants to meet, to talk things through. I told him I'd ask you first. Thomas shook his head immediately. No, I'm not ready to see him. Not yet. Margaret agreed, though part of her ached at the thought of her son wanting to reach out. But wanting to talk and actually understanding what he'd done were two different things. Until Daniel could admit the severity of what had happened. Until he could show genuine remorse, she wasn't ready to face him. Richard nodded. I'll tell him you need time. He won't like it, but that's his problem, not yours. That afternoon, they drove back to Cedar Lane. The locksmith's van was already parked in the driveway when they arrived. Margaret's heart clenched at the sight of the house, the place that had been their sanctuary for over 50 years now feeling tainted, violated. They walked through the front door, and everything looked exactly as they'd left it. The dinner table still held dirty dishes. The pie sat on the counter, untouched, a thin film forming on its surface. It was like walking into a crime scene, evidence of a life interrupted. The locksmith worked efficiently, replacing the locks on both the front and back doors. Richard supervised while Thomas and Margaret wandered through the rooms, touching familiar objects as if saying goodbye. Margaret ran her fingers along the piano keys, no longer able to play, but still keeping the instrument polished and tuned. Thomas stood in his workshop in the garage, surrounded by tools he could barely grip anymore. When the locksmith finished, Richard handed them the new keys. Daniel doesn't have access anymore. Neither does Vanessa. This place is yours, and it stays yours. They returned to Richard's house before dark, but the trip had drained them both. Margaret felt a headache building behind her eyes, stress manifesting in physical pain. Thomas moved even more slowly than usual, each step deliberate and careful. Claire insisted they rest, and they didn't argue. Over the next few days, a routine emerged. Richard went to work, Claire managed the household, and Margaret and Thomas existed in a strange limbo between guests and refugees. They helped where they could, folding laundry, washing dishes, playing with the boys. But mostly they sat, thinking, processing, trying to make sense of how their family had fractured so completely. Daniel called every day. Richard answered once, listened for 5 minutes, then hung up and reported that Daniel still didn't get it. Still thought this was about miscommunication rather than betrayal. Still believed he could smooth things over with the right words. Vanessa never called. On the 4th day, Richard's lawyer friend, a woman named Patricia with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes, came to the house. She sat with Margaret and Thomas at the kitchen table and explained their options. Powers of attorney they could establish now, while they were still competent, to prevent anyone from making decisions for them later. Living wills that outlined their wishes for medical care, trusts that could protect their assets. The conversation was clinical, necessary, but it made Margaret's stomach turn. She'd never imagined needing legal protection from her own child. Patricia also explained the realities of guardianship proceedings. If someone wanted to pursue that route, they'd need to prove you're unable to make sound decisions about your own care. Given that you drove yourself here, are clearly lucid, and are taking proactive steps to manage your affairs, any judge would laugh them out of court. But it's still smart to have documentation in place. Thomas signed papers with a shaking hand. Margaret did the same. When Patricia left, She promised to file everything immediately and send copies for their records. That night, lying in the guest bed that was starting to feel less foreign, Margaret spoke into the darkness. "Do you think we'll ever go home?" Thomas was quiet for a long time. "I don't know if it feels like home anymore." The words hung between them, heavy with grief. Their house was still standing, still full of their possessions, still legally theirs. But home was supposed to be a place of safety, of belonging. And right now, it felt like neither. Days turned into a week. Then two. Richard never once suggested they should leave, never made them feel like they were overstaying their welcome. Claire actively encouraged them to stay as long as they needed. The boys adjusted quickly, delighted to have their grandparents around for extended bedtime stories and weekend pancakes. But Margaret and Thomas both knew they couldn't hide forever. On a Tuesday morning, Margaret found Richard alone in the kitchen before anyone else woke up. She poured herself coffee and sat across from him. "We can't keep living with you like this. You have your own life, your own family. We're disrupting everything." Richard looked up from his laptop. "You're not disrupting anything. You're family. This is where you belong if you need to be here. But we need to figure out what comes next." "What do you want to come next?" Margaret considered the question. What did she want? She wanted to wake up 3 weeks ago, when her biggest concern was whether the chicken would be moist enough. She wanted Daniel to be the son she remembered, not the stranger who'd sat silently while his wife plotted against them. She wanted to feel safe in her own home again. Since she couldn't have any of that, she settled for honesty. "I want to know that if we go back to Cedar Lane, we're protected. I want to know Daniel understands what he did wrong. And I want to know that Vanessa will never have power over our lives." Richard nodded slowly. "Then we make sure all of those things happen before you go back." He closed his laptop and leaned forward. "I've been thinking about this a lot. What if we set up a formal care plan? Not because you need one right now, but as insurance. We hire someone to check in on you regularly, a nurse or a home health aide. Someone who can document that you're doing fine, that you're capable of managing your own affairs. It creates a paper trail that protects you if anyone ever questions your competency." Margaret hadn't considered this, but it made sense. "Wouldn't that be expensive?" "I'll cover it. Consider it an investment in your safety." "Thomas, we can't let you do that." Richard's expression hardened. "Yes, you can. Because the alternative is you going back to that house without protection. And I won't let that happen. Daniel made his choice. Now I'm making mine." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. One son had abandoned them, but the other had stepped up in ways she'd never expected. Later that day, Richard arranged for a home healthcare service to do an initial assessment. A woman named Denise, probably in her 50s with a warm smile and competent demeanor, came to Richard's house and spent 2 hours evaluating Margaret and Thomas. She checked their vital signs, asked about their medical histories, tested their memory and cognitive function. At the end, she pronounced them both in good health for their ages, with no signs of dementia or serious impairment. "You're more capable than a lot of people half your age." Denise wrote up her report and promised to send copies to Patricia, the lawyer. She also agreed to do weekly check-ins once they returned home, just to establish a pattern of oversight. That evening, after the boys were in bed, the 4 adults sat in the living room. Margaret and Thomas on the couch, Richard and Claire in armchairs facing them. The television was off. The house was quiet. Richard broke the silence. "I think it's time to talk about what happens next. You can stay here as long as you want, forever, if that's what you need. But I also know you want to go home eventually, so we need a plan." Thomas cleared his throat. "We've been thinking about that too, and we've decided. We want to go back to Cedar Lane, but not yet. Not until we know it's safe." "What would make it safe?" "Honestly," Margaret said, "knowing that Daniel understands what he did, really understands. Not just apologizing because he thinks he should, but actually seeing how much he hurt us." Claire spoke up quietly. "Do you think he's capable of that?" The question hung in the air. Margaret wanted to say yes, wanted to believe her son could recognize his mistakes and genuinely change. But she honestly didn't know anymore. Richard leaned back in his chair. "Here's what I propose. You stay here another week. We get all the legal protections finalized. We arrange for Denise to start her regular visits. We make sure the house is secure and that you have emergency contacts in place. Then, if you're ready, you go home. But on your terms, with boundaries. And if Daniel wants a relationship with you after this, he has to earn it back." Margaret looked at Thomas. He nodded slowly. "That sounds reasonable. And if at any point you don't feel safe, you come back here. No questions asked, no guilt," Claire added firmly. For the first time in 2 weeks, Margaret felt something like hope stirring in her chest. It wasn't over. The damage Daniel and Vanessa had caused wouldn't heal quickly, but maybe with time and distance and the right protections in place, they could find a way forward. That night, Margaret slept better than she had since the dinner. Not well, but better. And when she woke in the morning, she felt something she hadn't felt in days. Determination. They would go home. They would reclaim their space. And they would do it on their own terms, protected and prepared. Because they were not helpless. They were not incompetent. And they deserved better than being treated like problems to be solved. The next week passed in a flurry of preparation. Patricia filed all the legal documents and confirmed everything was properly recorded. Denise scheduled her first official visit for the day after they returned home. Richard drove to Cedar Lane twice more, checking on the house, making sure everything was secure, even installing a simple security system that would alert him if anyone tried to enter. Daniel called 3 more times. Each time, Richard answered and delivered the same message. His parents needed space, and when they were ready to talk, they would reach out. Daniel's frustration was evident, but Richard held firm. On their last night at Richard's house, Claire made a special dinner. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and garlic bread. But it felt ceremonial somehow. The boys sensed something was happening and were unusually subdued. After dinner, Nathan climbed into Margaret's lap. "I don't want you to go." She hugged him close. "We'll visit all the time, and you can come stay with us too. Promise?" "Promise." The next morning, they packed their few belongings into their car. Richard and Claire stood in the driveway with the boys, waving as Thomas backed out. Margaret watched them grow smaller in the side mirror, this family that had taken them in without hesitation, and felt gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. The drive back to Cedar Lane felt different than the desperate escape 2 weeks ago. This time, they were choosing to return. This time, they had a plan. When they pulled into their driveway, the house looked exactly the same. The gutters Vanessa had criticized still needed cleaning. The paint still showed its age, but it was theirs. Fully, completely, legally theirs. Thomas turned off the engine and looked at Margaret. "Ready?" She took a deep breath. "Ready?" They walked up the front steps together, Thomas fumbling slightly with the new keys before the lock turned. The door swung open, and they stepped inside. Home. It didn't feel quite right yet. The air was stale from being closed up. Dust had settled on surfaces. The dishes from that terrible dinner still waited in the kitchen. But it was still home, and slowly, carefully, they would make it feel that way again. Margaret opened windows while Thomas gathered the dirty dishes. They worked in comfortable silence, the rhythm of decades of partnership guiding their movements. By evening, the house looked lived in again. The dishes were clean. Fresh air circulated through rooms. They'd even managed to salvage part of the apple pie, though it was far past its prime. As the sun set, they sat together on their back porch, the same place they'd watched countless sunsets before. The garden needed weeding. The fence needed painting. There was work to be done, but for now they just sat, holding hands, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to deep purple. Tomorrow, Denise would come for her first visit. Tomorrow, they'd start figuring out what their new normal looked like. Tomorrow, they'd decide if and when they were ready to face Daniel. But tonight, they were home, and that was enough. The morning after their return brought unexpected clarity. Margaret woke early, drawn to the kitchen by habit and the need to reclaim familiar routines. She stood at the counter where she'd prepared countless meals, her hands moving automatically to fill the kettle, to retrieve cups from the cabinet. Everything was exactly where it had always been, yet somehow it all felt different, like returning to a childhood home as an adult, recognizing the space but no longer quite belonging to it. Thomas found her there 20 minutes later, staring out the window at the garden she'd neglected during their absence. Weeds had sprouted between the roses. The bird feeder hung empty, small signs of neglect that would take weeks to correct. I was thinking about calling the hardware store, see if Jimmy still works there. We need new paint for the fence. His voice carried forced normalcy, the tone of a man trying to convince himself that routine could erase trauma. Margaret turned to face him, and something in her expression made him stop mid-reach for his coffee cup. "Thomas, we need to talk about Daniel." His jaw tightened. The name hung between them like smoke. What's there to talk about? He made his position clear. No, Vanessa made her position clear. Daniel just didn't stop her. That's different. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, silence is agreement. Margaret pulled out a chair and sat, gesturing for him to do the same. After a moment's hesitation, he joined her, his movements stiff with resistance. "I've been thinking about this constantly, every night at Richard's, lying awake, trying to understand how we got here, and I keep coming back to the same question. When did Daniel stop seeing us as his parents and start seeing us as a burden?" Thomas looked away, his fingers drumming against the table. Does it matter? The result is the same either way. It matters because if we're going to move forward, we need to understand what broke. We need to know if it can be fixed. Some things can't be fixed, Margaret. Some betrayals are too deep. She reached across the table, covering his restless hand with hers. "I'm not saying we forgive easily. I'm not saying we pretend nothing happened. But Daniel is still our son. Somewhere inside that man who sat silent at our table is the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. The boy who cried when his goldfish died. We raised him to be better than this, which means either we failed as parents or something else is going on that we don't understand yet." Thomas met her eyes, and she saw the war happening behind them. Anger battling with grief, pride wrestling with love, the eternal conflict of a parent whose child has disappointed them, but remains their child nonetheless. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that before we write him off completely, we at least try to understand. Not for his sake, for ours. Because if we don't, this will eat at us for whatever time we have left." The kettle whistled, shrill and insistent. Thomas rose to silence it, pouring water over tea bags with methodical precision. When he returned to the table, his shoulders had dropped slightly, the defensive posture softening into something more vulnerable. And if we try to understand and discover that he really doesn't care anymore, that Vanessa's right and he's just been too cowardly to say it himself, what then? Then we'll know, and we can move forward with that knowledge instead of spending our remaining years wondering what if. They drank their tea in contemplative silence. Outside, a cardinal landed in the empty bird feeder, pecked around hopefully, then flew away. Margaret watched it go and made a mental note to buy seed. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock. Denise arrived punctual and professional, carrying a medical bag and a tablet for her notes. She greeted them warmly, asked permission to enter despite having been invited, and conducted her assessment with efficient kindness. Blood pressure, pulse, a few cognitive questions, a review of their medications. The entire process took 30 minutes. And at the end, she smiled. "You're both doing remarkably well. Honestly, I've seen people half your age in worse shape." Thomas grunted acknowledgement. But Margaret caught the flash of vindication in his eyes. They weren't helpless. They weren't incompetent. They were exactly what they'd always been. Two elderly people managing their lives with dignity and determination. After Denise left, they spent the afternoon on small tasks. Thomas tackled the bird feeder, filling it with seed and cleaning accumulated debris. Margaret worked in the garden, pulling weeds with careful deliberation, her arthritic fingers protesting but persisting. By evening, Both were exhausted but satisfied. Physical labor, however modest, provided tangible proof of capability. That night, as they prepared for bed, Margaret's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and felt her heart skip. Daniel. She looked at Thomas, who'd gone rigid at the sound. Should I answer? His expression was unreadable, conflicted. Finally, he nodded once, sharp and reluctant. Margaret pressed accept and raised the phone to her ear. Hello, Daniel. Mom? His voice cracked on the single word. Please, I need to talk to you. Both of you. I know you're angry and you have every right to be, but please just let me explain. Explain what, exactly? That you and your wife plan to sell our home out from under us? It wasn't like that. Vanessa was just talking, just throwing out ideas. We weren't actually planning anything. But you didn't stop her. You didn't defend us. You sat there and let her talk about us like we were property to liquidate. Silence stretched across the line. Margaret could hear him breathing, could picture him in his house, probably pacing, running his free hand through his hair the way he'd done since childhood when stressed. I know. You're right. I should have said something. I was just so tired that night, and Vanessa gets these ideas in her head. And sometimes it's easier to just let her talk them out rather than argue. And I thought she was just venting, not serious, and I never imagined you'd overhear. And I certainly never thought you'd leave like that without saying anything. And the kids were so confused. And Ivy cried herself to sleep that night asking where you went. And I messed up, Mom. I really messed up. The words tumbled out in a rush, tripping over each other in their urgency. Margaret closed her eyes, torn between maternal instinct to comfort and the fresh wound of betrayal that refused to heal. Daniel, do you understand what you're apologizing for? Are you sorry we overheard? Or are you sorry that conversation happened at all? More silence. This one felt different, heavier, like he was actually considering the question rather than scrambling for the right answer. I'm sorry both happened. I'm sorry Vanessa said those things. I'm sorry I didn't shut her down. I'm sorry you felt like you had to run away from your own home because of us. I'm sorry I made you feel like a burden when you've never been anything but generous and loving, and everything parents should be. His voice broke on the last words. Margaret heard him crying, soft sounds he was trying to suppress, and something in her chest cracked open despite her best efforts to remain guarded. Your father is listening. Do you want to talk to him? Thomas had moved closer during the conversation, close enough to hear both sides. Now he took the phone from Margaret's hand, his expression still hard, but perhaps fractionally less so. Daniel, Dad, I'm so sorry. I know that's not enough, but I don't know what else to say. Thomas's grip on the phone tightened. You could start by explaining how you could sit at our table, eat our food, and not say a single word while your wife plotted to take everything we've worked our entire lives for. I don't have a good explanation. I was weak. I've been weak for a long time, and I didn't realize how weak until you left, and I had to look at myself honestly for the first time in years. What does that mean? It means Vanessa has been pushing this agenda for months. The facility, the house, all of it. She's convinced that you're not capable of managing on your own anymore, that it's our responsibility to intervene before something terrible happens. And instead of standing up to her, instead of defending you the way Richard did, I just kept quiet. I told myself I was keeping the peace, avoiding conflict, but really I was just being a coward. Thomas's expression remained severe, but Margaret saw something shift in his posture. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Why didn't you come to us directly? Why let it get to the point where we had to overhear these plans secondhand? Because I knew what you'd say. I knew you'd be hurt and angry, and I couldn't face that. So I just kept avoiding it, hoping maybe Vanessa would drop it or you'd decide on your own that you wanted to downsize or something would happen that would make the decision easy without me having to be the bad guy. Thomas shook his head, even though Daniel couldn't see it. Life doesn't work that way, son. Hard. Conversations don't magically resolve themselves. You have to have them. I know that now. I know a lot of things now that I should have known 2 weeks ago. 6 months later, Margaret stood in her garden watching Thomas repair the fence he'd promised to paint. The roses she'd replanted had taken root, blooming brighter than before. Inside, Denise had just finished her weekly visit, pronouncing them both healthier than most people half their age. The house on Cedar Lane had become home again, slowly, carefully, on their own terms. Daniel visited now, but differently. He came alone at first, then gradually with Emma, who'd asked hard questions about why Grandma and Grandpa left that night. Vanessa never apologized, never acknowledged her words, and they'd accepted they never would. But Daniel had done the work, proven through consistent action rather than empty promises that he understood what he'd almost destroyed. Richard still called every Sunday. Nathan and Lucas spent weekends helping Thomas in his workshop. Claire and Margaret exchanged recipes by text. The family hadn't healed completely, probably never would, but it had reformed into something more honest, more resilient, built on boundaries and respect rather than obligation and assumption. Standing there in the afternoon light, Margaret realized something profound. They hadn't just survived betrayal. They'd reclaimed their dignity, their autonomy, their right to determine their own path. And sometimes, that's the greatest victory of all.